Now, here's another question from an art historian herself. She says, I'm glad Anurag ji is taking up this critical issue. And she says something very important, I think. Not having original artifacts to refer to hinders even today the study of whole disciplines like Mughal paintings, where either the manuscripts are collected in museums or they're torn into individual folios and dispersed in private collections. So I think this second question almost answers the first one, that, if you believe that a civilization has some sort of primary right to study itself, and the ethic has some kind of primary primacy over the emic, then you want these artifacts to be available right where they belong. And I think now, once again, we must have digital copies made so that the world is one type of thing also prevails. Now, let me also ask a couple of more questions, then you can answer. Then they say that she adds, there are numerous manuscripts which still have notes on their folio stating that they were looted in this or that year when the library of this or that Indian ruler was looted and burnt. So these artifacts themselves contain the proof of their pilferage or gaslighting. Okay. Uh, then it's a wonderful follow-up question. He says, she says, the British hate and blame Hitler for the same crime of looting their heritage and oil paintings, which they did uh, to India and other Asian and African countries. So, oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a huge movement to retrieve the stolen paintings of the Nazis, and the litigation around them still continues, to date. So why shouldn't the same standards apply? And then someone says here another question: how do we address the issue of the child not taking care of her mother? Miserable condition of architecture and artifacts in India. Okay, so you can answer that, and then we'll see if there's more.
Okay, sorry, so I'm going to go in the chronological order of the questions. So, Professor Hada, very interesting question on Jigyasa or curiosity. Now, from our perspective, there need to have been two things when an object was taken. A, it needed to have they needed to have consent. B, whoever gave consent should have had the permission to give that consent. That's it. It's really as simple as that. So consent is to say, hey, so I can see, for example, Professor Hada, you're wearing a dashing red stole or muffler around your neck, right? Now, if I were to really love that muffler, let's say I'm a researcher, I really want to see the Tana Bana or how the muffler was made, etc., etc. I have the right to have it under two circumstances. A, you give me consent to take the muffler. B, you have the right to give me that consent. Now that muffler cannot be Makaranji's and you've borrowed it and then you've given it to me, etc. Now, the problem we have is a lot of these objects that get taken away, A, they were taken without consent. B, these were public objects. They were made for certain communities, which means no individual or family had the right to give the consent in the first place. Now, if you look at a lot of faith objects, people who owned, controlled, or took care of those objects did it in their capacity as trustees, right? And again, I'm going back into the legality that Makaranji talked about. So there is a king, there is a kingdom. The king is only the caretaker of a particular temple. Now, unke jo vanshaj hain, they don't have the right. They don't own that temple or what belongs in there. It's the idea of trusteeship, not ownership, which means they did not have the right to sell it or give it away in the first place because it wasn't meant for their individual pleasure. It wasn't meant to be bequeathed to them. So, and I believe we have to turn the whole idea of provenance on its head. And Emily, if you're listening to this part still, if we haven't lost you, we have to turn the whole idea of provenance around, where it should be incumbent on the current owner to prove that they have consent and that consent was given by a person who had a right to give that consent, versus the other way around where we have to prove that, hey, this is ours. Second, fascinating question from the art historian lady. I apologize, I didn't get your name, ma'am. About not having originals in India, and that hinders the ability for us to research. Absolutely, I from a legal perspective, I view it almost as an IP kind of an issue, an intellectual property issue, for countries that have thousands of years old of a civilization. Um, what we would call different forms of kala in India, right? It could be sculpture, it could be painting, it could be textile, writing, scripts, fonts, what have you. Each of these is an art form. Some of these art forms have linkage to faith. Some of them have linkage to history. Some of them have linkage to community. So there's a huge intersectionality between art forms and various other disciplines. Each of these pieces of art is relevant as a form of intellectual property, as something that at some point somebody in India built using a particular set of tools, knowledge, understanding, what have you. And our inability to study and own that IP is a problem today. It genuinely is a problem today, both at a tangible IP level and an intangible IP level. I'm going to give you an example very simply. This is the paradox that I can't imagine how somebody could consider this behavior normal. Back in the British Museum, you have um, Gallery 33 and 33A. Now, the gallery actually has a ring that Tipu Sultan wore. Right, so there's a ring. A few feet away from that ring is a painting of the dead body of Tipu Sultan and British soldiers robbing away all the jewelry from the dead body. Right, and I'm just holding my head and thinking, oh my God, how can this level of cognitive dissonance be okay with you guys, where you're actually documenting the loot and are proudly displaying the loot and the documentation of that loot. I mean, where I come from, you try and hide away evidence of loot, but it is what it is. Um, Third question on the British blaming Hitler and the efforts to recover Nazi art. Again, this for me is the same paradox of the cognitive dissonance that I keep talking about. I know I can't name it here, but Emily knows who I'm talking about, and Alex definitely knows who I'm talking about. But there is a huge, let's just be politically correct and call it a track two effort, led by a few powerful Jews in London, in the UK, and from the West Coast in the US, who are engaging in lobbying, engaging in legal efforts, and building narratives around recovering the art, recovering all the Jewish art looted by the Nazis. And I'd like to go back to what Professor Makaranji was saying a while back. I think what we need from India, there's a fascinating article in the Washington Post from a few years back. For those who like reading between the lines, the article is interesting because it was written by the Global Opinions editor. Now, the Global Opinions editor, Karen, as we all know, editors don't normally write articles. They commission certain people to write articles, and they edit it. Now, the two people that from India that this lady commissions are Barkha Dutt and Rana Yu. So the editor wrote a very interesting article comparing the efforts of India and China, how one is based on, let's just call them Gandhian principles of conversations, morality, etc., while the Chinese model is based on force and force and power and what have you. I genuinely believe that, you see, what India cannot do today with the UK or with anybody else is what they did with us 200 years back. that is not a sustainable model, right? We're talking of history. Every time power equations change, so I loot you today, you loot it back tomorrow, and then I loot you day after, and vice versa. This is, the old parampara of khandani dushmani, which never goes away. What needs to happen now, and which is where IIAS kind of or Institute of Art and Law kind of organizations come in, is we live in a world of ideas. We need to be able to collaborate and reframe the lens with which this is seen, at least at a thought leader level. And thought leaders almost always emanate primarily from academia, and then at some point it goes mainstream. Then at some point people start caring about it, and then it becomes important enough for for electoral votes, and then governments start bothering about it, etc., etc. So I think what's really important is for us to is to come up with a fundamentally new model. So we don't have brute force like the Chinese do. We don't have wealth like the Jews do. What we have, or what we have had historically, is the intellectual prowess. Right? I think what we need to do is to institutionalize that, collaborate across cultures, across countries, whatever it is. Build an appreciation that, hey, listen, here is a wrong that needs to be corrected, and through peer-reviewed journals, through articles, blah blah blah, push the idea out, and let the sapling grow into a new social norm. And I really hope that happens. The last question around, what do you do when a child doesn't take care of the mother? So I will tell you, sir, what Gandhiji told. I don't know who it was. Probably Churchill. I'm pretty sure it was Churchill. So when Churchill said, "Hey, listen, you are a huge country. How will you manage on your own?" and blah blah blah. And we all know now there's enough evidence to prove how much of a again here media, especially fiction media, films, novels, etc., have done a great job of edifying Churchill, right? But we now know, based on historical record, how much of a racist he was, and how much he pretty much had genocidal tendencies. I mean, the whole Bengal famine uh, does not come to somebody of sound mind. So Gandhiji had told him that, look, India has a bunch of problems, but those are our problems, not yours. So I think we need to go out and start saying that more boldly. A whole bunch of nations are broken. That does not give other nations or other communities or other civilizations the right to poke their nose. Um, I'm not. None of us here are pontificating on the quality of council homes in England, or the opioid crisis in the US, or rampant extremism in the Middle East. None of us are forcibly pushing our point of view on solving those challenges. Um, so I would say that, look, if of course, we are far from perfect. I mean, it's a long, long way to go. But that's our problem to deal with. It's not for somebody else to come and usurp our right to deal with problems that we need to deal with. I don't know if that answers your questions. I'm happy if you have follow-ups or other new questions, uh, if they've come up.
Thank you, thank you. I think Anuragji, you answered these or responded to these issues and questions really well. I think that your idea of scaling up, to make effective and heard a voice which is contrary to, whatever the accepted and passive, complicity of our own elites who are, whatever you may call it, the spoilage was. I think that's very well taken. And also to fight with the weapons that you know how to handle, not to borrow other people's weapons, because then you might be inept at them. So we can't be like our own colonizers were, nor can we be like the Chinese. But of course, our own colonizers, the British certainly, were very good at narrative building. They were also very good at games. British games are played all over the world, and cricket, as Ashish Nandi once said, was an Indian game accidentally invented by the British. Anyhow, now I just thought that on that note, I would invite Emily G to say a few words of how she looks at it, how she, views not only your presentation, but this whole issue of trying to reclaim these objects. So Emily G, we want to hear from you. Do you think this is a kind of reactive, chauvinistic pushback, or do you think there's merit in this kind of endeavor?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak. And thank you, Anurag, for a very fascinating presentation, as always. I've heard you speak several times, and always very engaging, and so many sort of good stories to bring these issues to light. And I think that is a lot of the sort of key to this, I suppose, in the sense that you talked just in the last few minutes about the sort of methodology and the way in which India is trying to carry forward these issues and these questions through dialogue and understanding and communication and awareness generally. And I think that has increased very much over the last few years, and certainly in the work that we have done at the Institute of Art and Law, which you mentioned, we've been working for a project that the Arts Council in the UK has been involved in by way of producing some guidance for UK museums on restitution and repatriation issues. And certainly in all of the conversations we've had, the key to sort of progress on these issues and to some kinds of resolutions, which we all appreciate, are very difficult. There are sort of centuries of history to kind of work through. The key is very much communication and open dialogue and transparency. These institutions which have been housing these objects, sort of understanding more about their history and their provenance, such that these conversations can come from a sort of transparent point of view. So that's really the gist of what I have taken from this whole process. But yeah, some really interesting ideas for everyone on the call today, certainly. So thank you very much, Anurag. I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say.
Thank you, Emily G. Going back to the question I raised in the beginning, Anurag Ji, I think that, when I was sort of playing the devil's advocate, we've got again, a variety of possible, re-engagements with these objects, I think the best one is the one you showed, how the living presence of a, purloined deity, re-energizes a town or a locality. I think that, in a sense, even the word koil in Tamil actually means the home. It's like if the deity has been kidnapped and must be restored to his or her home, and they live there, they're tended to by their devotees and priests, and they are a part of the, living, environment of that community. And to take them away is like spelling the kind of doom to that community, because the deity gives them a center, a locus, and it's not just physical, but as you said, psychological. And to uproot the deity would then almost be tantamount to a terrible atrocity, a psychic assault on that community. Okay, so returning the deity home in that sense, to that temple or that sacred precinct in which they belonged, is obviously, in a sense, the best option. Now look at the other things. Then the other option is to return them to a museum in India. There are many deities who've been so uprooted, we don't know where they came from. And then the third is, if you just think about this carefully, I would rather personally that, when I talked about Tibet, I deliberately, because here's a community that has lost a country, So suppose I'm a Tibetan, I can't go to China, I'm not allowed to go to China. But I could go to Chicago, I could go to London, and I could see some of these objects. Ideally they should be in Dharamshala. I'm just saying that, so it's better for these objects to be in museums where they're accessible. Like the British Museum is accessible to everyone, it's free. You can put a donation, they ask you to put in at least £5, but it's still free, than in somebody's private home, which I cannot access. Some rich person, showing off this whatever stolen or dubiously acquired artifact in their own drawing room. In fact, I'll tell you a little story in a moment about this. So that's better to be in a public space than in a private home. And finally, it's better to be retrieved than completely destroyed. There are idols that have been destroyed to an extent that there are heads in one place, arms in another place. You can't even glue it together. So rather, like the Bamyan Buddha, somebody has offered to put them all back together. We now have technology, but it's a huge project and you need to be very safe. You need to have experts being safe to restore. So I'm saying rather than it being completely destroyed, better that it's preserved somewhere. But here's the story after which you have the last word. And perhaps you can even tell us about the charity to which you want us to send your honorarium. If anybody else wishes to contribute, you can make a pitch for that and then we'll end. There's a wonderful little short story by R.K. Narayan called Two Horses and a Goat. So it's about this American tourist who comes in a traveler to this remote village in Tamil Nadu. And, he runs out of gas. His station wagon runs out of gas. He gets out. And he sees this shepherd who doesn't know a word of English with he's just got two goats, okay? He's very poor. And you spoke about spouses at the beginning. So this guy has also been kicked out of home in the morning saying, "You good for nothing, old man. Go and earn a bit of money. We have nothing at home." So as usual, he's out there and, dreaming of some windfall, which will change his fortunes, at least to the extent that he'll have a warm supper when he goes back home. And here's this American tourist who starts chatting him up. And we don't know this. I mean, he doesn't know it, rather we know it. The American wants to buy a statue, which belongs to the village. It's right there. If you go to any Tamil Nadu village, there are these fierce deities at the edge of a village, which are supposed to protect the village. So what's happening is these two horses, which belong to the village. They're the village's heritage. And the American is negotiating a price with this guy because he thinks that he owns that statue because he's sleeping under that shade, the canopy. And they come to some kind of deal. So he says, "Yes, 200 rupees, and then this guy goes home and shows his wife, 200 rupees. So she says, "You must have done something illegal." He said, "No, I just sold the goat." So his wife says, "That old goat couldn't have fetched you, 200 rupees. And sure enough, the goats come grazing back home because they know their way home. And in the meanwhile, the American has loaded the statue, onto a passing truck and siphoned some diesel for his petrol for his car. And he's talking about it to these guys and says, "You know what? This will sit in my, atrium in my Manhattan penthouse. This beautiful statue of this man on a horse." So, I mean, this is a story of colossal misunderstanding, and, where I think I brought it up partly because Emily ji said that it's a matter of conversation. It's a matter of, communicating with one another. And he's buying something that doesn't belong to the person from whom he's buying it. And I think a lot of the loot and plunder of artifacts all over the world, is presented in this metaphorical manner in the story. So, your last words, Anurag ji.
Well, I'm going to start off where you left off, from a fictional story to a real story. And this is not me participating in the outrage Olympics at all. Back in 1968, Wendy Doniger, who now heads the Asian Studies program or whatever it's called at Harvard. So she's written about her travels through India and a whole bunch of faith objects which she essentially took from here and took it back with her, and how they adorn her home now and all of that. So we're not talking about a fictional story. We're not talking about R.K. Narayan here. We are talking about having conversations with people who consider it absolutely legit to pick up what they like, take it back home, and guess what? They actually grow on. They actually go on later in their lives to lead South Asian Studies program and represent our voice at their universities. And that's something which we should be kind of worried about. Going back to the other question, and I couldn't agree with you more. These are very complex issues between the 20, 50, whatever number of people we have on this call. We will have multiple opinions, right? What is the core principles? How do you deal with exceptions to those principles? Who signs off on those principles? Is it a community? Is it a government? Is it a no? So it's going to be. It's not going to be easy at all. We're talking of. We're really talking about a conversation about reframing morality, right? So to me, it is no difference from, let's say, a conversation on whether dowry should be banned. It's a conversation on whether African Americans get to use the same toilets and the same bus. It's about women suffrage. None of these conversations are easy. I mean, you will have a lot of men that said women should not be allowed to vote. You'd have a lot of women that said they don't want to vote. So we'll have a lot of opinions which will need to be sorted out, and it's going to be complex. It's going to be push and pull. Now, just because an ideal answer doesn't exist doesn't mean you should live with something you know is wrong. And that's a larger principle which, that's a larger thought I'd like to leave you guys with, which is to say that, hey, should we live with something that we know is fundamentally immoral, unethical, illegal in today's context? Perhaps it was legal then, just as it was, I don't know, it was legitimate to beat up your wife at some point of time, but today you won't dream of it. Is it okay for us to live with something that we know today is immoral, just because a wilted, violent worldview said it was legitimate back then? And is it okay to take the lack of an ideal solution as a good enough excuse to live with something that we know is wrong? And that's, so while we sort the ideal solution out, we need to stop living with something we know is wrong to begin with. With that as the core principle of at least how I view this. Again, I'd like to thank you, Makarandji. This is fascinating. I mean, what's interesting about conversations with you is you always walk away thinking about whatever belief system you came into the conversation with, and I think that's how growth, that's how development happens. So I'm really thankful that I'm really thankful to you. I'm thankful to all the 4 people who had those questions. I'm thankful, of course, to Emily who's here and to everybody else who's watching. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure going forward we'll start building those partnerships that you talked about. We'll start having those conversations. We'll start mainstreaming this. It is time. It is time for the world to sign up to doing the right thing on this issue. And finally, India is at a place where we can kind of nudge this conversation. So I'm very glad that we've started having it. Thank you.